Good evening, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Carolina de Robertis to our At Home with Literati series in support of The President and the Frog. She will be in conversation with Naima Coster. For our attendees, chat is closed, but I will be dropping links to purchase The President and the Frog from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and a selection will be asked at the conclusion of the event. Reminder that you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States, and that we're also open for in-person shopping. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. A writer of Uruguayan origins, Carolina de Robertis is the author of 5 novels, including Cantoras, winner of a Stonewall Book Award and a Reading Women Award, and a New York Times Editor's Choice. Her books have been translated into 17 languages and have received numerous other honors, including a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. De Robertis is also an award-winning translator of Latin American and Spanish literature. She teaches at San Francisco State University and lives in Oakland, California with a wife and 2 children. Naima Coster is the author of 2 novels, What's Mine and Yours, an instant New York Times bestseller, and her debut, Halsey Street, which is a finalist for the 2018 Kirkus Prize for Fiction. Naima's stories and essays have appeared in Elle, Time, Paris Review Daily, and elsewhere. In 2020, she received the National Book Foundation's 535 honor. Naima writes the newsletter, Bloom How You Must. She lives in Brooklyn with her family. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Carolina and Naima.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Literati. Carolina, it's my honor to be with you tonight and to celebrate your wonderful book, The President and the Frog. It was such a pleasure to read it. And thank you for asking me to be in conversation with you tonight.
Oh, it's absolutely my joy. I am so thrilled that you could join me, and we'll talk more about how much I love your work and, and the incredible What's Mine and Yours that I hope everyone will go look at and get and swim through. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk and celebrate with me.
Oh, of course, it's my pleasure. And thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. For those of you who have not yet read or picked up The President and the Frog, I encourage you to do it. There's a link available in the chat for purchase. It was wonderful, and I'll share more about what I loved about it. But what struck me in reading this book was how different I found it to be from your previous book, Cantoras. And Cantoras is the first book of yours that I'd ever read, and I loved it. It reminded me of why I came to fiction first as a reader and then as a writer. It was immersive, transportive, it was sexy, but also full of sorrow and meaning. It was sweeping, but also deeply personal, and I adored it. And it got me out of my pandemic reading rut. And so I was so surprised and thrilled to find that The President and the Frog was so different and offered an entirely different set of pleasures. But I also found it so moving. I thought it was philosophical and strange and smart. And at first I thought it gave me something like instructions for life. And then I thought, no, it's not a didactic book, but maybe ideas for life and for living. It was such a good companion to me. So thank you for it. And I wanted to start just by asking how this book came to you.
So thank you so much for all of that and all of that context. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. And I also want to say just really quickly, thank you, Literati. Thank you to the Literati Bookstore. Let's support them and buy books. I'm so glad that you could be here, that you could host us. So this book came to me, the seed of this book came to me before I started writing Cantoras, actually. So often the seed idea of a book will be with me for a very long time, usually years, before I sit down and write the book. And those years are what I think of within myself as the dreaming phase of a novel. And so the dreaming phase of this novel started 8 years ago. In 2013, I was living in Uruguay, and Jose Mujica was president, and he is a person who's the inspiration for this book. He was a very progressive president and was kind of a beacon of hope to people, not just within Uruguay, but beyond it, also passing very forward-thinking legislation and just kind of refreshing what was seeming possible for the country and also for culture. And, he also has a very down-to-earth style. He never wore a tie. He, drove this beat up little VW bug and just kind of spoke his truth, whatever it might have been, very working class. And he had been a revolutionary who had been incarcerated brutally during the dictatorship years in Uruguay, which is the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, which is when the novel Cantoras opens, right? That novel Cantoras also delves into that period of Uruguayan history from a very different perspective, these 5 queer women who meet during that time. But so while I was living in Uruguay in 2013, I read an interview where he just mentioned very passingly that he in part survived and stayed sane in the brutality of solitary confinement after torture and inhuman treatment by talking with a frog. And this just sort of stayed with me. And he kind of said it like he had made the frog a pet, or he engaged in connection and conversation with the frog. But I just kind of, for me, that was a seed. And I think often for many of us as novelists, novels begin from burning questions or for an image we can't get out of our minds, because that image is a sort of portal to something else. Right? A portal to something larger or deeper than the thing itself. And I found myself really wanting to hear what those conversations were. I really wanted to know, well, like, what is that? What does that look like? What are those internal conversations that a person might have with themselves when all seems lost, right? When they're alone in this hole and things seem bleak and the country seems lost. The political situation is crashing down on you. Your life has crashed down on you. What are those conversations that fuel different possibility and allow you to go on, and then go on and have a remarkable life? So that was the beginning. That was the seed, and it stayed with me. And I wrote in my journal in 2014, if I ever am bold enough to pursue this wild idea for a book, my greatest dream would be that it could be like a love letter to any of us who's ever felt despair. And that was before the Trump era, of course, right? By the time I sat down to write this book, we were in a different place collectively as a country here in the United States, right? In early 2017. So I carried that consciousness with me as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so grateful that you did chase that idea, because this book offered so much to me, and it certainly is a love letter to anyone who might be currently or has experienced despair. So thank you so much for that. I am curious, Carolina, whether you see this book as particularly different than your other novels, whether you see it as a continuation of the work that has come before, if you see it as riffing or some kind of departure. How do you see it connecting to your previous books?
Oh, I love that question so much. And I definitely see it as connected to the other books. So, this is my 5th novel. And, at least for me, I don't know how it is for other novelists in the long arc of career necessarily, but for me as a novelist, I start to see where the threads are that connect the works to each other. And I've also gotten a lot out of reading all of the novels that someone wrote over the breadth of their life. So like reading all of Toni Morrison, all of James Baldwin, or even thinking about, Louise Erdrich, Jose Saramago, how they moved from theme to theme, style to style. That's been an inspiration to me. Because I think every writer is different, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with writing, books that are stylistically or structurally similar, for 40 years. That's a beautiful career. But for me personally, I'm drawn to really listening for what a book wants to be. And really letting the voice of the book and the message of the book, the themes of the book, shape the way that the book comes through. So I think one of the threads that connects all of my books, and it's not necessarily that I sort of consciously set out for this, but it's what I observe taking a look at them, is that I think all of my books are in some ways about how we get free. What does it mean to get free within ourselves, to get free within the context of the society that we inhabit, to get free collectively,
Yes.
as a culture, as a society, as communities, and also, sort of within ourselves, in our own spirits, how do we get free? And what are those internal journeys and barriers and possibilities? And so in that way, I feel like this book is definitely drawing on and continuing that exploration. And then one of the things that's different about it is, yes, absolutely, sort of the style and what's needed for it. I really felt that while Cantoras is sort of painted on a really large canvas, it's almost a mural, right? So it's a big, long novel. It takes place over 35 years. It has 5 protagonists. I felt that those stories would be best served by a large sweeping canvas. I also felt that way about my first novel, The Invisible Mountain, and my third novel, The Gods of Tangle. So three novels I've written that have been on a big sprawling canvas. So I'm drawn to that. I can do that. That's a beautiful thing about the novel, but the novel is so capacious, right? I mean, Naima, you've written 2 novels too, and each of your novels is unique and I think potent in its own way, Halsey Street and What's Mine and Yours. And, I love that about novels, is that so much is possible. And, because sprawling novels have things that they can do in the world and for stories. And then short novels that kind of fly like an arrow have also really inspired me. So if we take one person like Toni Morrison, I love her big, vast, architecturally complex novels like Beloved and Song of Solomon. And I will sit at the feet of those magnificent works all my life. And I also really admire what she accomplished in Home and A Mercy, and certainly The Bluest Eye. But those are these like very short, lean novels, right, that do something different. And in their lean portraiture, they lift up something else. And so, and so it felt like for me, and so I felt like for me with this book, this was a book that was going to be mainly a conversation, between two beings in a room. And then it's paralleling another conversation, but it's really kind of coming in close to one strand. And that I just felt that that the material would be best served that way.
Yes. And something that I found so remarkable about this book is how much life is contained in it, despite the constraint that you sort of created for yourself by having the future president in a cell for so much of the book, for half of the book, but there's still so much life that comes into the narrative. We get a sense of the larger life of the nation, and we get all of these other characters who emerge and become real to us through the story that the future president is telling to the frog. So I thought that was just remarkable in a way that this book was expansive, even if it has a small cast and takes place in these contained moments and confined spaces. And we'll talk more about the structure. I'm curious to pick your brain about the structure later. But I wanted to ask if you would read from the book for us before we continue our conversation. And I want to remind the audience members that there are a couple of ways for you all to engage with Carolina and with this conversation. There's a chat where you can share comments with one another. And then there's also a Q&A button where you can submit your questions for Carolina to consider at the end. So I want to encourage people to drop any questions that they might have there, and I'll keep an eye on them, and we'll get to them later in the evening. But will you read for us, Carolina?
Sure. Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you, Naima. So the book moves back and forth between 2016, when this unnamed character, former president of an unnamed Latin American country, he's being interviewed by a foreign journalist about his experience being president. And he's sort of tempted to tell the secret story of how he really survived the brutality of his earlier years through this connection with a frog. And it moves back and forth between that 2016 sort of present day conversation and the conversations that he had with the frog when he was incarcerated in a hole, basically, where food would come down on a rope and he, was sort of broken and lost. So I'm going to dive us into a moment that takes place in that hole 40 years back. Come on, wake up. The frog A voice so clear it sliced through thought. The sound of it in his ears and ribcage flooded him with relief. It's you. He tried to sit up to better see the creature in the dim light, body stiff and awkward. And no wonder, he thought. I'm past 40 after all. Too old for this sort of thing. Ha! Maybe I should tell the guards this whole situation isn't age appropriate. That'll show them. I wasn't sleeping. Liar. Really, I wasn't. Your eyes were closed. And why not? There wasn't anything to see. So you were going to droop all day. With a jolt, he realized the ants had gone quiet. Why? How had the frog's appearance led to relief from the screaming of ants? Had they fled out of fear or of being eaten or trampled? Or did the voice of one somehow cancel out the voices of the other? Frogs versus ants, the great war for a dirt hole or for the mind of a man trapped in a hole. Ha! Now there was a story for Homer's ballads. His mind flashed to it. Homer, on an ancient stage or in the corner of a pub or brothel or wherever he sang his songs, drowning in booze and insults, because what a pathetic story, ants and a man in a hole. The image brought fleeting relief, a flicker of comfort before it disappeared. Maybe. Well, so what the hell else am I supposed to do? Get ready. For what? The rest of your life. Laughter rose, rancid, up his throat. There is no rest of my life. I'm going to spend it here or in hole after hole after hole. Not true. And how would you know? The mysteries are a layer and a layer. Mysteries? It was nonsense, of course, but something about the frog's words, the way they hung together, was unnerving. What, you're a priest now? Because I don't need any of your frog sermons. Yes, you do. Something clutched at his heart. He fought to ignore it. I hate priests. I hate church. I'm sure I'd also hate frog church. Oh, you'd love frog church. And how the F would you know? I know. The frog took a few breaths that inflated its throat, then flattened it. I know things. Humph, sure you do. Like that you've barely started. Started what? Life. Ha, now who's the idiot? My life is over. Over. I'm never getting out of this hole and all the holes after this one. There's nothing left ahead but a long, endless string of them. And if I ever do get out, I'll be a wreck. I mean, look at me, just look at me. I'm starved, bruised, broken. He hadn't seen himself in a mirror for years. Wouldn't want to, wouldn't dare. I'd be useless to the world. Meanwhile, the dirt. Dirt? Yes. Haven't you seen it? All around you. Look. Yes. Why, yes, I'm in a rank hole with a dirt floor. I can see dirt. Thanks so much for pointing that out. You haven't even started looking. You can't see it. You're so blind, you cannot even see the dirt. Now you've really gone off the deep end. Everything real is in the deep end. He opened his mouth, couldn't speak, sat gaping, tried and failed to muster a response. He made a sound that didn't coalesce into a word. The frog cocked its head slightly, stared for a beat or two, then hopped into a dark corner and vanished, leaving the future president with new thoughts churning through his mind.
Thank you for that. Yes, that was beautiful. And it resonated so differently hearing it now that I've finished the novel. Seeing where, what happens with the dirt and with the frog.
Now you know where it's going.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's going somewhere.
It sure is. It sure is. Thank you for that. I wonder about the choice to leave the former president, the future president, the poorest president in the world unnamed in the book. What you were up to there, or how you thought about that, because we know, for instance, that the reporter who comes to see him is from Norway, and we know about the horrible recently elected president in the north. But will you talk to us a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's 2016. So in the Americas, we know who has terribly been elected in the North without a name. So there's specificity of some countries and places, right? Yes, absolutely. What a great question. I think, as novelists, we have so many aesthetic choices before us to create a work, right? And it can be hard sometimes to know, which way to go, what stylistic choice to make, what aesthetic approach to take. And I think one of the reasons that I have taken, in some ways, such different aesthetic approaches in each book is that I really weigh them individually for each story. And in this case, it was really thinking about what is gained and what is lost with each choice. And I wanted certainly to draw inspiration from a particular person's journey, Jose Mujica, in Uruguay, and to draw inspiration from Uruguayan political and historical context. But I also wanted to kind of unlatch this story from that historical and cultural specificity, and give it a little bit more freedom. And I think that when we unlatch from specificity, one of the things we can do is kind of move towards fabulism or the parable, that kind of telling, almost a fairy tale. I mean, even the title of the book, I see, is playing on a fairy tale, right? The Princess and the Frog, and I don't know that everyone will necessarily hear it that way.
I did.
You did? Okay.
Yeah.
Play on a fairy tale, and I also see it as sort of playing on our gender assumptions, right? So it's sort of a gender bending piece of that too, of the Princess and the Frog, that's a story for girls, that's a feminine story. Well, is it? Well, what are those stories of transformation? And what if we put a president in that role? What does that do to our assumptions? But so in any case, so in terms of the unnamed protagonist and the unnamed country, it freed me, among other things, to really explore and dive into the story, where I felt like I could pay tribute to the real histories that have been lived, but do my due diligence in terms of my responsibility to real histories, because I do think as novelists, much as we engage our imaginations, we do have responsibilities to real lived experiences. But I also would be more free, to say, well, this is sort of a parallel universe where the country is unnamed and the people are unnamed. And so wanting to kind of resonate with and hum with a larger story. And I have written books, including Cantoras, that have had a huge amount of historical detailing and specificity. This is really Uruguay. This is Montevideo. This is what the street looks like. I've been to that street, and I felt like that story was served by specificity. And then this was just a different sort of narrative enterprise of well, what if I kind of unlatch it and tell it in this other fictional cosmos? What else becomes possible, and how does it get to resonate on other places? And I do feel like I have the good fortune of getting to draw on a very rich tradition of, especially authors from the global South, who have written incredible novels that are set in unnamed countries, based on either one or more countries in that region that those people are from, like Salim Haddad's Wapa, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Autumn of the Patriarch, Mohsen Hamid's Exit West has a lot of specific places, London, San Francisco,
but not the place of origin.
Do you remember that? Right. So the place that the two main characters are originally from is an unnamed Middle Eastern country or South Asian country. And so that does something to the story that allows it. I mean, I think Exit West is a book that I returned to a lot writing this book, because it really does use parable, the power of parable, to tell a very political and socially urgent story in that instance about refugees and the refugee crises of our world. I mean, I think it's such a relevant, timely book, even as it doesn't name the original country, and in some ways, because that serves it, you know. So
Yes.
that's been very inspiring to me.
Yes, I have so many questions hearing you speak. One is, I'm curious how that sort of unlatching from specificity changed the way you engaged with research, if there was separate research that you did for this novel, because I know that you already have done research in the past, and it was that seed that sort of got you started. So I'm curious about that, what that unlatching changed about research. And then my second question is what books you see this book in conversation with. You named some of them, and I had some that it reminded me of, but maybe we'll start with the question about research and, you know, whether the process was different here than with previous novels, how you engaged with research as you were writing.
Beautiful, yes. And I'd love to hear what books you see the conversation with. That would be so amazing to hear. That would be phenomenal. Yeah, in terms of research, you know, I tend to take really deep dives with research when I write, just because of the nature of my books so far. They've required a lot of research. My first novel, The Invisible Mountain, took me 8 years to write, partly because it's a big, long, sprawling intergenerational saga, and partly because I really wanted to imbue it with the research, you know, research history of Uruguay. And that took time. And also, of course, I was working full time and all the things. But so that said, you know, the research that I had done for my first novel and for Cantoras was connected to the subject matter of this book, as we've already touched on, right? The era, the revolutionary era in Uruguay and the dictatorship era in Uruguay are subjects that I have been deeply engaged with and obsessed with and writing about for 20 years now. So by the time I sat down to write this book, I had, you know, well more than a decade of research. I have shelves and shelves of books that I've sort of collected, you know, out of print, dog-eared from people's houses and used bookstores, and, you know, photocopied from, you know, university libraries because I can't find them anywhere else. And I have this collection. So definitely this was the first time that I wrote a book realizing, oh, I'm drawing from a very deep well that I've actually been cultivating this whole time. So that was an amazing discovery. That said, there was absolutely unique research for this too. So I did take a deep dive with Mujica himself and his interviews and books about him that aren't really available in English, but there's a lot in Spanish. So, you know, I took that dive and revisiting some of the old materials. And then I did other research. I'm always researching. I think in some ways, the way that we live and walk through the world when we're novelists is connected to our research. And so, you know, I read Solitary, which is Alfred Woodcock's incredible memoir of being in solitary for decades here in the United States. You know, so that, you know, that very brutal, you know, story in this very powerful memoir was part of, okay, I want to connect with this. What else can I connect this to? And I did research into, you know, Japanese refugee experience in South America after World War II. There's very, very little. But once I saw that that was connected, you know, I took the dive that I could. And I also think that, I will say, I think authenticity readers are connected to research. I would count it, even though it's a layer of research that happens once we've already got at least one draft. You know, we mostly call them sensitivity readers, and I'm all in on sensitivity readers. And I think the term authenticity reader is actually more accurate, or it centers the marginalized person. Right, because the problem isn't that readers are so sensitive.
Right.
That's not the problem. The problem is the term sensitivity reader almost like puts the onus on, oh, well, you know, this marginalized person might be offended by what you wrote, and you don't share it. It's like, no, that's not the problem. The problem is the author may not have yet made this portrayal authentic. And that's our responsibility as people in the publishing community.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So I will just say, I'm, that's part of my way that I work, and none of that takes any responsibility away from the author either. If a portrayal, doesn't land well with people who are members of a marginalized community that's being portrayed, it's not to say that we can't be in conversation about that. Or take responsibility for that. But I think what's important is that that I, as a writer, stay awake to what it means and do the work that I can on my end.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the books that you see the President and the Frog in conversation with, I'll tell you what came to mind for me.
Please.
I thought of 2 novels by Julia Alvarez. I thought of In the Time of the Butterflies, and I thought of In the Name of Salome, like these books about revolution and revolutionary ideas, but also about danger and oppression and persecution and survival, and what possibility still exists in conditions of extreme duress. So I thought of those novels,
I love that.
which I loved and were very important to me. And I thought of the Murakami short story, Super Frog Saves Tokyo.
I haven't read it. I'm going to read it immediately.
Yes, it's great. It's great. It's about a frog who enlists the help of a man to stop an earthquake in Tokyo. And it's a story that doesn't concern itself too much with whether the frog is real or imagined or whatever it might be. And it also reminded me of that short story as well. So I see it in conversation so much with Exit West. That didn't occur to me as I was reading it, but it's very fitting hearing you speak. And I wonder if there are any other books that you see it speaking to. I can't wait to teach this book also.
Oh my God, really?
Yes.
That is so wonderful.
For many reasons, to talk about expansive realism, which is a term I heard you use to describe this book, to talk about the structure and how books can investigate storytelling while still unfurling a story that is compelling on its own, or multiple stories. But are there any other books that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for saying that. It's lovely. And yes, expansive realism is a term that, I coined just for myself to be able to have conversations with myself and others about these mechanisms, because I feel like anything that is outside of naturalistic realism, quote unquote, and empirical reality that's written by a Latin American or Latinx person automatically gets called magical realism, right? And then Costa doesn't get called a magical realism, even though the dude wakes up as a bug in Metamorphosis. So there's this way in which things get talked about in terms of the distinctions between surrealism and magical realism and parable and fabulism, and even speculative fiction, that I think obfuscates the way that all of those ways of writing and telling story have always been in conversation with each other, and have always been connected with each other, and have always been part of our literature. They don't even have to be sort of this very separate, oh, well, that's magical realism over there. In the sense that, the very first books of what we think of as the, quote, Western tradition, end quote, right? Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, we have goddesses, flying into the battlefield to change the course of the action, right? So it's always been there in some way. So for me, expansive realism is this, as you mentioned, so this umbrella term for that whole territory of possibility in storytelling. And for me, Exit West really is one touchstone of how it can very much be about talking about and portraying urgent realities about our actual world. Yes. Right? Because in Exit West, for those who haven't read it, it is about the refugee crisis, and there is these doors that in the world inexplicably turn black. Like it could be a closet door or someone's kitchen door, and when people walk into the blackness, they come out in another part of the world, and it just sort of transforms the meaning of migration And so the story really opens up these very big, deep questions that have everything to do with sort of who we are in our current world. So there's that. But in terms of other books that are testaments, I love you thinking about the Alvarez with me. I mean, I know I believe I read both of those books while I was writing The Invisible Mountain, my first novel, and I had already named my revolutionary character Salome, you know. And so, you know, very, very profound connection there with so much affecto, affecto for those books. And I think this book is in conversation with a lot of sort of revolutionary writing about revolutionaries, about the possibilities of revolution, of transforming society, of kind of devoting yourself to, pushing up against, injustice, living in resistance, among other things. Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig was a really important book for this. It really impacted me deeply when I first read it. And also it's basically two characters in a jail cell talking, through the book. And yet it has this very strong dramatic arc, right? There's a lot of story, even though 90% of it is just two people in a jail cell talking. And can they trust each other? And what's going to happen in this conversation? And one of them is a revolutionary, and the other is either a gay man or a trans woman, depending on how you read the book. And it's very much about not only the revolution and political change, but also what is a revolution if it cannot love the people who've been reviled by society? And it sort of pushes up against even the homophobia in so many, certainly political movements of the 70s, which was when the book was written. And so that book gave a lot of inspiration to this. And I really revisited it like, okay, what are the possibilities for a big, full dramatic arc in the context of a conversation? I went back to Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, which is in Spanish is called Distancia de Rescate. It's in translation. And that book is also a whole conversation. It's very short, but it's all one sort of conversation in which all of these explosive things come forward. And Women Talking by Miriam Toews, which is literally women talking in a barn for 2 days, which could sound like there's not a lot of plot, but there's so much at stake because they're part of this religious community that has had this horrific sexual abuse, and they need to decide, do they stay or go? And so, the stakes are really high, and so much of it is a conversation. And so you used the word constraint earlier, Naima, and I think that's really beautiful and apt. And sort of sometimes when we create a constraint in a story, it can sort of up the pressure of the story. And so it doesn't have to remove possibilities for narrative tension so much as clarify them, and sometimes so that was my hope with this, was like, okay, it's just this pressure cooker. So what's inside of it? Right. Yeah.
I love hearing these texts, and I want to revisit our conversation and put together the President and the Frog reading list, because I think these books would be fascinating to look at alongside one another. And it's interesting to hear how it informed your process. I will say I am curious how you wrote this book. And what I mean by that is there is this structure that you've mentioned of the two parallel conversations, if we can call them parallel conversations, of the former president when he's speaking to the reporter, and then the same man when he was the future president, when he's talking to the frog, and then these two parallel conversations. How did you write them? Like, did you write one and then write the other? Like, did you chronologically write the conversation with the reporter and then the conversations with the frog? Did you go back and forth in your writing process much in the order that the book exists now? I just wonder about how you approached the parts of the story, or if you just wrote to know this character and his stories before you even placed him in the hole with the frog.
Right. Like how it's processed, right? Like how do you get in there and then how do you make two strands that will sit alongside each other and sort of support each other?
Yes. And I'll add one thing. I said two strands, and I think that's true, but also this is a book that has layers and layers of storytelling. So we might be in one strand, but then we go back and back and back in time, or deeper. And so it was just so rich and multi-layered. And I wonder how you approached the writing of it.
That's an interesting thing too. Thank you for saying that. And also you think about, okay, if the book is 2 strands and each strand is sort of a conversation mainly between 2 people, it sounds like it's not very highly populated, but in fact, all of us, any one of us could be sitting in a room alone, and that room would actually be exquisitely populated by complexity and human experience via memory, right?
Yes.
So each and every one of us, you, Naima, could be sitting alone in a room, and all of the people you've interacted with, even the books you've read, like Julia Alvarez's stories, right, are inside of you in some way, and your memories are inside of you, right? So there is a beautiful cacophony always present wherever a human being is present, because we are multivalent and have multiverses inside of us, right? So I think as storytellers, we can draw on that, right, to weave something that is richer than it might at first seem. In terms of how I went about it, I the first time I wrote a novel, my first novel, I was so terrified the whole time, pretty much terrified for 8 years straight, that I wasn't capable of writing a novel.
Oh.
You must be laughing because you can't relate.
No. I mean, this is like the eternal question. Every time you sit down to write, it's, do I know how to write this novel?
Can I do this?
Yeah.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
I was teasing. I'm like, because I don't know. Can you relate? Right. But I was so, in the first novel, I was so, I don't even know if I can do this. That revision felt sort of terrifying, because if I reread a draft, my first draft, my 5th draft, my 13th draft, and I saw things that still needed work, that was frightening, because of that inner self-doubt that, does this mean that I can't actually do it? Now I understand the extent to which revision is deeply part of the process, right, of growing a novel. And that is very freeing, because it means that in the first draft, you can really explore. You can be wild. You can be messy, right? You can let those risky things arrive on the page. And I think it's ultimately better for the book if we don't play it safe, right? That first time around, the 6th time around, right? And so that the messy truths and the risky truths can reach the page. That is all to say, by the time I was starting to write The President and the Frog, and I had finished Cantoras and the books before them, I was able to really free myself to just start, write 40 pages, go, this is not working. I know this voice isn't right. Let me start over, and really follow the book where it needed to take me. So the book was in first person at one point, then I went back to third person, then I went back into first person, and I was like, does this need to be in first person? So I went and revisited first person books that I felt were really driven by a powerful first person voice. Like I went back to Milkman, for example, which is such an amazing novel of like the first person just carries you. And I tried reading Milkman and jumping into my president's voice, and I think I accessed things about him by doing that. So none of that is wasted. And then I made my way right back into third person before it really started to sing. So giving myself room for those drafts was a really big part of it. And then in terms of the pacing between them, I feel like pacing is something that we can address in later drafts once we know what actually wants to come forward, what the story wants to be. And so I really gave myself permission to write each strand and get onto the page what they each needed to do, with the understanding that I would rearrange sort of mosaic pieces, later on. And I did, I rearranged the pieces so that they would sit alongside each other. And then once in ways that would serve the story, would lift the story, and hopefully create a dramatic arc that would carry the reader along.
I mean, you absolutely did. The work that you did in this book is so exquisite. Like, I loved it from the beginning, but I found that it was one of those books that I loved more and more as
Oh.
I continued. I thought to myself, what a challenge Carolina has given herself of placing this president in the hole. And I wonder how it's going to resolve, like, this conversation, this search for meaning and possibility in a bleak place. And I love the way that you ended it. I'll just say that, and I won't say any more for anyone
Won't
else
say the
who hasn't.
specifics of why and how, but you loved
Yeah.
the way it ended.
I did. I love the way the conversations with the frog resolved. I thought it was bold and evocative and imagistic and just wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I can remember writing those scenes and thinking, this feels really, really true to me in some raw way. And I sort of put a piece of my best thinking, but also of my soul into it. And I thought, what if, it's very different from anything I've ever written or even read. And so I thought, I don't know, before I had the first readers, I don't know how this will land, whether it will land for others.
Yeah.
Intended, and I think that's when we write things that are very themselves.
Mm-hmm. So, well, I loved it. And even more than that, I found it deeply memorable. And it left me with many questions. So in a way, it was an opening in the book rather than a moment when things closed for me. I wanted to say one more thing before we open it up to questions. For anyone who's listening who wants to share a question now is a good time. I'll be turning to them shortly. But I wanted to share something that occurred to me as I was reading the book. The president, while he's imprisoned, is allowed to read only science books about nature. And they're sort of considered safe books. That's why they're passed along to him. But they're actually books that are deeply subversive. And he calls them holy books because of the possibility that they capture the power of life, of collective effort, of us. And as I was reading your book, I couldn't help but think of it also as a holy book. And I don't know what your associations are with that word or what it's like to hear as a novelist, but I thought that it was a book that contained insights that I wanted to share with people that I love. So here's some things that I thought I want to text this passage to this friend who's having this hardship. Like, I want to put these lines about love in my anniversary card to my husband. We had an anniversary recently. I thought I want to get a tattoo, like, to remind me, right? Of what it is to endure and to hold on to hope in a way that does not feel trite or dishonest, but comes from a deep sense of human possibility and collective power. And so I felt very much that this was a holy book in many ways. So thank you for it. And I don't know if you think of books as holy, or what kinds of books you think of as holy, or even, it's such a fraught, charged words for many reasons. But I found that it fit The President and the Frog. And so I just wanted to share that with you.
That is beyond amazing to me, and so moving. And there is that piece in the book where he says, they only gave me science books because they thought it was the only safe thing, because it didn't have anything about human expression, so it wouldn't be subversive. But it was so subversive because ecology, what could be more subversive? We're all interconnected. That's it. That's the revolution. We're connected to each other. So he found the revolution there. And I definitely, for me, there are so many novels that have meant so much to me that I approach them as holy books. I mean, Beloved is a holy book to me, right? And I think, everyone has a different relationship to that term, but I think it can be very powerful to approach fiction and stories when they resonate for us that way on our own terms, or collections of poetry when they resonate to us in our own terms in that way. That can be such a powerful space. And I didn't mention this in the research, but I did revisit holy books as part of my research for this book, in thinking about the spiritual and emotional and psychological possibilities of the conversation between the frog and Mujica, or not Mujica, the unnamed protagonist. But what?
Yes.
Right. So like, but what was that? What was that kind of like awakening within himself? And so the Bhagavad Gita is a holy book, an ancient holy book written in Sanskrit that is a conversation between a human and a divine person, saying, "Why should I go on? I'm sitting down in the battlefield. I can't go on." And I've read that book in many translations over the years, sort of as a humble guest in that tradition, but I definitely returned to it. And Patakias, which are the sacred Orisha stories about Elegua in particular, which is this sort of trickster energy. So I did turn to touchstones to ask questions about how this book might draw on some of those sort of deeper undercurrents of what it means to be alive, whether people frame that as spiritual or choose to frame it in another way. So that is all to say that your experience as a reader approaching it with that lens is so beautiful to me.
Well, I just adored the book, and I think that it's brilliant. So thank you for it. And it was unexpected in a way that was really delightful, that writers and stories can surprise us and can grow and shift in wonderful ways. So thank you. We have a couple of questions from folks in the audience that I'd love to get to. We can get to perhaps two. And so I'll read the first one. And this first question is from Caitlin. And Caitlin is curious whether your books, especially The President and the Frog, have gotten different reactions or receptions in Uruguay or Argentina for Gods of Tango and Perla than, say, in the United States among readers from other countries. So whether your books have received different receptions in different places, and also if you have ever worried at all in writing this book about how people from Uruguay would react, given to the fact that Mujica is a recognizable figure.
Yeah, great questions, wonderful questions, and thank you for those questions. And hello. So yeah, I mean, I think with each book, it's been different. And not everyone, so Perla and the Gods of Tango have not been translated into Spanish yet. So, fingers crossed that that'll happen sometime. But The Invisible Mountain, I actually toured with it in Spanish in Argentina and Uruguay. And it was a completely different set of questions, because of my first novel, I would start conversations about The Invisible Mountain in the United States, often with a little explanation of where Uruguay is, which, by the way, is, Brazil, big country in South America. It comes down to a tip, and there's a little heart-shaped, round-ish place underneath, and that's that little country. That's Uruguay. And so, whereas when I'm in Uruguay, and for example, the Tupamaro guerrilla revolutionaries, of which Mojica formed part, and of which one of my characters in Invisible Mountain also formed part. I would sort of introduce the idea of their existence in the United States, but in Uruguay, I would be on the radio, and people would say, well, I am a former Tupamaro, and what I want to know is, when you made this and this thing, what did you think of this? I mean, it was, we were starting in a completely different place. But I was really moved by the level of warmth and reception with the book. I was really surprised and delighted. I think the greatest compliment I got in Uruguay was people would say, I can't believe you didn't grow up here. I grew up as an immigrant in all these other countries, from the depth of intimacy that you had with the stories. And I think that's just because I really took my time with that book. Yes, I was so moved. I mean, Naima, right? As an immigrant or child of immigrants, that push-pull can be, right, about belonging and connection to a country that's your root country. You feel it so deeply, but it is different from having lived there all your life. So that meant a lot to me. And then, with Cantoras, it's just starting to be read in Spanish in Uruguay and Argentina. And so far I've had, incredible conversations with people about it. And it's been very positive. With The President and the Frog, we'll see what happens. It's being translated now into Spanish. certainly that was part of my thinking in terms of making it an unnamed protagonist in an unnamed country, and wanting to kind of, create that buffer space sort of out of respect. But I also, that was another thing I did in terms of authenticity readers, is I had a couple of Uruguayan people who are historians who lived there all their lives, who have a different Uruguayanness than me, read it for how balanced it feels in terms of, portrayal of the different political stages of Uruguay and the revolutionaries, and because that history, people lived it, and people do have very different experiences with it, and there is a lot of trauma, and I wanted to be sure that I didn't inadvertently hit on that trauma in a painful way. So I did do some of that in my editing as well. And I just come at it as with a lot of love and do my best. And I think as writers, that's what we can do.
Yes.
Does that resonate with you, Naima, your work?
Oh, yes. But also I feel that I'm learning from you, Carolina. So it's an honor to listen to you and hear about your process. But this is what you've shared is related to our second question that I want to spend some time on, if you're willing, from Nina. And Nina wants to know how you write, meaning what your routines are, like whether you're a daily writer or if you move from project to project with gaps in between. And relatedly, if you have any advice for writers who are struggling to write and balance other work in this difficult and unsettling time. So to balance family, to balance teaching and other work, how you write, and any advice you might have for writers who are struggling. And I'll say, I'm listening to your answer to this one too.
Yeah, well, I definitely, whatever it takes for you to stay in your writing space and writing mode, Naima, may it happen. And I hope you do it, because having read your first two books, I am already eagerly awaiting your third. So,
thank you.
So, ánimo, yeah, escribir.
Yeah.
So I think there is out there the advice of writing every day. To be a real writer, you write every day. And I think that advice is so problematic, and makes a lot of assumptions about the way people's lives are set up. And often that's a gendered assumption, especially for those of us with kids. So, I think that, Marge Piercy once said, the real writer is the one who really writes. So we want to have a writing practice that is in some way continuous or has space in our lives. For some people, that might mean working every day on their writing, but for some people that might not be sustainable. For me personally, especially working on a novel, if I work 40 minutes a day before work, some people do this, it's like a 40-minute chunk a day, I would go out of my mind, because by the time I'm 40 minutes in, I'm just getting started, and that process doesn't work for me. I would rather, if time is really at a crunch, I would rather just have one carved out Saturday where I take a deep dive, and for 4 or 5 hours I'm in the work, than have those little chunks throughout the week. But that is also me getting to know my own writer's temperament, and my own way of writing. So I would say try something, and see how that structure works. See if you can make a commitment to yourself for the next 3 weeks. This is how I'll structure my approach to making room for writing in my life. And then 3 weeks and evaluate and go, oh, well, maybe those big long chunks are actually too much pressure. And maybe I'd rather have it be like, 4 p.m., my little alarm goes off and I'm always at 4 p.m. writing. Whatever, for poets, that might work better. Or just that's your temperament. So I would say experiment with different approaches, different ways in. I have one Philip Glass album that I listen to only when I'm writing fiction and never at any other time. And it has this kind of, talk about holy books, right? Like, spiritual traditions do this, right? Like this song is only for this, and it works for me. Just find what those things might be and find community. If you have friends or fellow travelers who are also artists, and you can set up a time to chat or Zoom, where you just talk about, I'm going to set goals for the month. And then we're going to set a time at the beginning of next month, we're going to talk about how those goals went. That can create, you can think about accountability partners, but más bien it's like support partners,
yes.
Company, on the journey. Community, that's one way community can look. Writers groups, but build community, find ways to connect with others who share this very strange, weird, wonderful path of living as a writer, and know that the process really is everything. It really, right, Naima, like having finished the book, it really is about the process. Like, enjoy the discovery and the journey of creating, and go easy on yourself during COVID. If you're a person with young children, and today's back to school for my kids, and it's just so full, it's so much. So, and even if you don't have kids, COVID has done many things to many of our lives. And so being loving with ourselves along the way is a big part of it as well. Because when we love ourselves, we can love our inner writer. So do that too, I would suggest.
Yes. Thank you, Carolina.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you again, Carolina and Naima, for joining us for At Home with Literati, and a reminder to buy The President and the Frog. The link is in that. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Literati. Thank you, Megan. Good night.